May 26, 1940, Winston Churchill stood in the dimly lit war room beneath Whitehall, staring at maps that seemed to shrink by the hour under the relentless weight of Germany's advance. Red and blue markers crowded the board, each one representing divisions that no longer existed as cohesive fighting units. France had fallen faster than anyone in London had believed possible. What had been expected to hold for months had collapsed in weeks. The German blitzkrieg had shattered assumptions, doctrines, and confidence in equal measure. Along the northern coast of France, the situation was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of British and Allied soldiers were trapped along the beaches of Dunkirk, forced back by armored spearheads and relentless air attacks. They were hemmed in by the Nazi war machine, with the sea at their backs and little room to maneuver. Every hour that passed brought German tanks closer to the coast. Every new wave of the Luftwaffe struck harder, bombing ports, sinking ships, and tearing at morale. Reports arriving in London grew more desperate by the minute. Churchill understood immediately that this was more than a military emergency. This was a test of Britain itself, a moment that would define whether the nation would endure or collapse under pressure. The British Expeditionary Force represented the core of Britain's trained army. If it were destroyed or captured at Dunkirk, Britain would be left dangerously exposed, stripped of the men it needed to defend the homeland. In that outcome, the idea of continued resistance, let alone victory, would become almost unthinkable. The fate of a free Europe hung in the balance. The Prime Minister turned to his generals, his face set with urgency and resolve. There was no room for hesitation, no comfort in half measures. "We must get every man off that beach," he said. Every man. The words were simple, but their implications were staggering. It meant attempting something no one had ever done before, evacuating an entire army under direct enemy pressure. Across open water, while under constant air attack, the room fell silent. Senior officers exchanged glances, fully aware of the enormity of what was being asked. The English Channel, Britain's last lifeline, was narrow but brutally exposed. German aircraft dominated the skies, and the Navy did not have enough ships designed for shallow waters. Ports were already under fire. No detailed plan existed. No precedent offered guidance, yet even in that moment of despair, Churchill saw a fragile glimmer of possibility. If firepower could not save the army, perhaps courage and ingenuity could. Improvisation would replace doctrine. Speed would replace perfection. It would be a gamble, one born of necessity, but it was the only option left. And so, from that dim war room, a decision was made that would echo across history. Britain would attempt the impossible. It was nearly lost far from the front lines, in quiet conference rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and unresolved tension. Around polished tables and folded maps, men debated command structures, authority, and responsibility, issues that sounded abstract, almost bureaucratic, yet carried consequences as lethal as any artillery barrage. A poorly defined chain of command could delay an advance. A bruised ego could stall cooperation. A single misjudgment in leadership could ripple outward, costing thousands of lives long before a single shot was fired. Victory in Western Europe was not only a matter of tanks and divisions. It was a matter of who listened, who compromised, and who insisted on being right. It was nearly lost in press briefings. Those carefully staged moments where generals and politicians stood before microphones, knowing that every word would echo across oceans. These briefings were not just updates. They were weapons of perception. A confident statement could steady morale at home. A careless remark could spark political backlash, inflame rivalries, or expose cracks in Allied unity. In wartime, words move faster than armies. Once spoken, they could not be recalled, only interpreted, misinterpreted, and exploited. More than once, a single sentence threatened to undermine months of planning, forcing leaders to scramble not on the battlefield, but in the realm of narrative and public trust, and perhaps most dangerously of all, it was nearly lost in the fragile, often tense space between allies who desperately needed one another, but did not always fully trust one another. The coalition that fought in Western Europe was bound together by necessity, not uniformity. Different nations brought different priorities, different political pressures, and different visions of how the war should be fought and how the peace should look afterward. Old grudges lingered beneath polite smiles. National pride clashed with operational reality. One careless claim of credit, one mismanaged statement of intent, and the cohesion of the alliance could have fractured. Such a fracture would not just have threatened a single battle, but the entire campaign, and with it, the future of Europe. This is the side of war that rarely makes it into simplified retellings. We remember the landings, the breakthroughs, the victories marked on maps with bold arrows. But beneath those arrows were human beings wrestling with uncertainty, ambition, fear, and responsibility. Decisions were made without perfect information, under immense pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. Some choices were brilliant. Others were flawed. All of them mattered. If stories like this matter to you, stories about leadership under pressure, about ego and judgment, about how history is shaped not just by firepower but by human decision, then W2 Rewind exists for exactly that reason. We don't just rewind the battles you already know. We rewind the moments behind them, the arguments, the compromises, the silences, and the words that almost changed everything. We look at history not as a sequence of inevitable outcomes, but as a chain of choices, each one narrowing or expanding what was possible. May 28th dawned with no sense of relief, only exhaustion layered upon fear. Soldiers waded through waist-deep water toward the waiting boats, their boots heavy with mud and oil, their uniforms soaked, torn, and stiff with salt. Many had not slept for days. Rifles were slung uselessly across their backs, ammunition nearly gone. On the sand behind them, tanks and trucks lay abandoned at awkward angles, mute reminders of how quickly the retreat had overtaken even the strongest machinery. Crews had disabled engines and smashed sights before leaving, knowing they would never return. The beach itself had become a narrow lifeline, crowded with men who understood that every minute mattered. Every small boat that reached the shore was packed beyond what it was ever designed to carry. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, river launches, anything that could float came in close, their hulls scraping sand and debris. Dozens of soldiers clambered aboard at once, upsetting the balance, water sloshing dangerously close to the gunwales. The channel was unforgiving, its rough seas rocking these overloaded craft as they pulled away. Some men vomited from exhaustion and seasickness. Others stared silently back at the shore, unsure whether they would ever see land again. Fear was constant, but so was discipline. Lines were formed. Orders were followed. Panic, remarkably, was held at bay. Officers moved up and down the beach, coordinating embarkation points with whatever tools they had left. Flags were waved, whistles blown, arms frantically signaled toward boats waiting just offshore. Shouted commands were nearly drowned out by engines, surf, and the distant thunder of artillery. The tiniest misstep could mean death, a stumble into deeper water, a delayed order, a boat that drifted too far and became an easy target. Yet the system, improvised and fragile, somehow functioned. Men boarded in waves, not knowing if the next wave would ever come. As the days wore on, the situation grew increasingly desperate. German artillery closed in. Luftwaffe attacks intensified, with waves of bombers and fighters descending on the beaches and the evacuation routes. Explosions tore into sand and sea alike, sending columns of water and debris skyward. Ships were hit and burned. Boats vanished in moments, leaving only wreckage and struggling figures in the water. Above it all, the Royal Air Force arrived in fleeting intervals, often unseen by the men below, engaging German aircraft in violent aerial duels high over the channel. Soldiers crouched on beaches, on decks, even in the water, praying for protection from the sky, sometimes cursing the RAF for not being there, unaware of the battles raging overhead on their behalf. And yet, amid this chaos, stories of courage and selflessness multiplied. A fishing boat captain from the English coast calmly guided his vessel through a suspected minefield, trusting experience and instinct where charts offered little certainty. A schoolteacher, barely trained and suddenly a sailor, hauled a wounded soldier aboard a small yacht, refusing to leave him behind despite incoming fire. Naval ratings stayed at their posts on burning ships long enough to load just a few more men. Soldiers who could swim gave up places on boats to those who could not. Collective bravery, quiet, uncelebrated, and relentless, carried the day forward on May 30th. As the evacuation continued under mounting pressure, Winston Churchill addressed the nation. Radio broadcasts spoke of Dunkirk as a miracle of deliverance, a phrase that would echo through history. But at that moment, the miracle was far from complete. Thousands of men were still stranded, still waiting on beaches and breakwaters, still vulnerable to attack. The words offered hope, but they did not change the reality unfolding across the channel. Every successful crossing was followed by another urgent return, another gamble against time and enemy fire. Small civilian craft continued to shuttle soldiers from shore to larger ships waiting offshore. These volunteers, many of whom had never imagined themselves in a war zone, sailed again and again, faces set with determination, hands blistered from ropes and tillers. There was no grand plan that could account for every variable. Coordination between the Navy, the Army, and the civilian fleet was improvised on the fly, daring in its execution, chaotic in appearance, yet undeniably effective. Orders changed by the hour. Routes shifted. New dangers emerged without warning. What held it all together was not a flawless strategy, but human resolve. Men adapted, endured, and acted when hesitation would have been easier. Dunkirk was not saved by a single decision or a single leader. It was saved by thousands of individual choices, made under fire, by people who refused to give in to fear. In the midst of retreat and disaster, heroism did not announce itself, it simply did what had to be done. June 1st arrived with the beaches of Dunkirk still crowded, scarred and dangerous, but something subtle had changed. The chaos that once defined every movement began to give way to a grim, learned efficiency. Soldiers no longer rushed the water in panic. They knew now how to wait, how to move when signaled, how to help the man beside them before helping themselves. Boarding procedures, once improvised, had become almost routine. Lines formed quickly. Orders were obeyed without argument. Men understood that speed meant survival, and discipline meant another boat would come back for those still waiting. Bombardment remained constant. Artillery shells slammed into the sand, and Luftwaffe attacks continued to rake the beaches and evacuation routes. Ships were still being sunk. Boats were still catching fire. But soldiers learned how to survive under this relentless pressure. When aircraft engines were heard overhead, men scattered or flattened themselves into the sand. They used wreckage for cover. They learned the sound of bombs falling and the brief moment to brace before impact. Survival became a shared skill, passed silently from one man to another through observation and example. It was in this environment, mud-stained, smoke-filled, and shaped by exhaustion, that what would later be called the Dunkirk spirit began to take form. This was not propaganda, not a slogan coined after the fact, but a reality forged under fire. It was visible in the way men steadied each other as they waded into the surf, in how wounded soldiers were lifted onto boats before the able-bodied, in how officers refused evacuation until their units were gone. There was fear everywhere, but it was no longer paralyzing. Determination had taken its place. By June 2nd, the scale of the evacuation became undeniable. More than 250,000 men had been pulled from the jaws of defeat and carried across the Channel. British soldiers, French troops, and other Allied forces crowded into ports and camps in England, many of them stunned to be alive. They arrived without weapons, without vehicles, often without even their boots, but they arrived. Each crossing represented not just a successful operation, but a refusal to surrender to inevitability. The civilian fleet, once an act of desperation, had become a symbol. Fishing boats, ferries, pleasure yachts, and river launches were no longer just vessels. They were proof that ordinary people could shape the course of war. These were not trained combat sailors. They were shopkeepers, fishermen, retirees, and weekend sailors who answered a call without knowing if they would return. Their courage did not erase the danger, but it tipped the balance just enough to make survival possible. In doing so, they redefined what national resilience looked like, not as an abstract ideal, but as action taken by individuals when it mattered most. Yet the cost of this achievement was staggering. Thousands of men were killed during the evacuation. Countless others were wounded or captured. Nearly all heavy equipment was abandoned. Tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, years of preparation left burning or submerged in the sand and sea. The retreat from France, despite the lives saved, remained a strategic disaster. An entire campaign had collapsed. The Allied armies had not defeated the enemy. They had escaped him. For those who understood the broader picture, the celebration was restrained. Winston Churchill himself grasped the paradox at the heart of Dunkirk. In private, he acknowledged what many feared to say aloud. The army had been saved, yes, but France had fallen. Europe lay under German control. Britain now stood alone, facing the very real prospect of invasion. Dunkirk, for all its heroism, had not brought the war closer to victory. It had merely prevented immediate defeat, and yet that distinction mattered more than anyone could fully grasp at the time. Dunkirk was not a victory in the traditional sense. There were no conquered territories, no broken enemy armies, no triumphant advances. It was something far rarer and more fragile. It was a lifeline, a second chance, a pause before the storm that everyone knew was coming. In that pause, Britain would rearm, reorganize, and prepare for battles yet to be fought in the skies, on the seas, and eventually back on the continent. The soldiers saved from the beaches of Dunkirk would form the backbone of that continued fight. They would carry with them the memory of retreat, loss, and survival. Many would fight again in North Africa, in Italy, and years later, return to France under very different circumstances. The lessons learned in defeat about coordination, air power, logistics, and leadership would shape every major Allied operation that followed. Dunkirk changed the war not by winning it, but by keeping hope alive when hope should have died. It transformed a retreat into a resolve, a disaster into a determination to endure. The turning point was not found in a single day or decision, but in the collective realization that survival itself could be an act of defiance. And from that defiance, the long road back to victory would begin. June 3rd and 4th marked the final, most precarious phase of the evacuation. The beaches of Dunkirk were no longer choked with the massive crowds of earlier days, but the danger had not diminished. Those who remained were often the most vulnerable rearguard units, wounded soldiers, and those tasked with holding positions until the very end. Smoke hung thick over the shoreline, and the constant thunder of artillery reminded everyone that the enemy was closing in. Time was running out, and everyone on the beach knew it. The final evacuation waves moved with ruthless efficiency. Soldiers were brought off the beaches and the long concrete mole in small, disciplined groups. Many were barely able to stand. Weeks of retreat, days without sleep, and the strain of constant bombardment had drained them physically and mentally. As they reached the decks of destroyers and transport ships, some men simply collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to speak, too overwhelmed to react. Others clutched wounds hastily bandaged with torn cloth, their faces gray with shock and pain. There was little celebration, only relief. Sailors and officers pushed themselves past the limits of endurance. Many had been operating almost continuously, making crossing after crossing under fire, snatching minutes of rest only when engines were being repaired or fuel taken on. Faces were streaked with oil and smoke, eyes red from salt and exhaustion. Yet the orders were clear: keep moving, keep loading, keep sailing. Each trip might be the last before German forces reached the harbor entirely. Each delay risked more lives left behind. The channel crossings during these final days were among the most dangerous. Luftwaffe attacks continued relentlessly, targeting ships packed with men who had already survived too much. Anti-aircraft guns fired until barrels overheated. Damage control teams fought fires and flooding even as the ships maintained speed. Smaller craft escorted the wounded where they could, while larger vessels raced for English ports, knowing that a single hit could turn rescue into catastrophe. Still, they sailed on. As the last men were taken from the mole, demolition teams prepared the port facilities for abandonment. Equipment that could not be evacuated was destroyed to prevent capture. The sound of explosions echoed through the ruined town, signaling not triumph, but finality. Dunkirk, once a busy port, had been reduced to rubble and smoke. When the final ships pulled away, the silence left behind was almost as heavy as the chaos that had preceded it. By the evening of June 4th, Operation Dynamo officially concluded. Over 338,000 soldiers had been rescued, an achievement almost impossible to imagine just days earlier. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a fraction of the British Expeditionary Force had become one of the largest evacuations in military history. The beaches were cleared. The mole stood empty. German forces would arrive to find little more than wreckage, abandoned equipment, and the marks of a retreat carried out under constant fire. Ships returned to British ports battered and blackened by smoke, their hulls scarred by shrapnel and near misses. Dock workers and medical teams worked through the night, unloading the wounded, distributing food, and guiding stunned survivors toward hospitals and barracks. Many soldiers were silent, unable or unwilling to speak about what they had endured. Others wept openly, overwhelmed by the simple fact that they were alive. They had left behind comrades, equipment, and a defeated campaign, but they had escaped annihilation. Yet, even in those first moments of safety, every officer and private understood the truth. Dunkirk had bought time, but it had not bought victory. The German army still dominated the continent. France was collapsing, and Britain now stood exposed. Weapons were scarce, defenses incomplete, and morale, though lifted by survival, remained fragile. The threat of invasion was no longer theoretical. It loomed across the Channel, visible in every intelligence report and every darkening horizon. And yet, something intangible had been forged in those final days. The evacuation had proven that defeat was not inevitable, that discipline and determination could extract survival from disaster. Soldiers who returned carried not pride, but resolve. They had seen how close destruction had come, and how collective effort had pushed it back, if only temporarily. The experience would shape how Britain fought the war from that moment forward. Dunkirk did not end the struggle. It redefined it. The men saved on June 3rd and 4th would train again, fight again, and eventually return to the continent. They carried with them the memory of smoke-filled beaches, of crowded decks, of exhaustion and fear, and of survival against the odds. In that memory lived hope, courage, and an unbroken fighting spirit. Operation Dynamo had ended, but the war had not. And Britain, battered but unbowed, was ready to face what came next. The evacuation of Dunkirk quickly became something far greater than a military maneuver, carried out under desperate circumstances. It transformed into a symbol that resonated far beyond the beaches of northern France. At a moment when defeat seemed inevitable and collapse imminent, Dunkirk offered a powerful counter-narrative. That courage, improvisation, and collective resolve could defy overwhelming odds. The world watched as an army escaped destruction not through dominance, but through determination, and that distinction mattered. What made Dunkirk extraordinary was not simply the number of men saved, but who saved them. This was not a story of generals alone or of flawless planning. It was a story shaped by ordinary citizens, naval crews, dock workers, airmen, and exhausted soldiers acting together in a moment of national crisis. Fishermen left their nets. Yacht owners left their leisure craft. Civilian volunteers stepped into a war zone with little training and no guarantee of return. Alongside them stood professional sailors and soldiers who refused to surrender to chaos. Together, they achieved what few believed possible. In Britain, the immediate impact was psychological as much as strategic. The nation had narrowly escaped catastrophe. Newspapers and radio broadcasts carried stories of survival rather than annihilation. While the reality of the retreat was sobering, the fact that the army had been preserved changed the national mood. Despair did not vanish, but it was held in check by a growing belief that Britain could endure. Dunkirk became proof that even when events went terribly wrong, the response to failure could still shape the future. Winston Churchill understood this balance better than anyone. He was careful to frame Dunkirk honestly, resisting the temptation to declare it a victory. In private reflection and public address alike, he acknowledged its limits. Wars are not won by evacuations, he warned, reminding the nation that survival was only the beginning. But he also understood what Dunkirk made possible. The soldiers saved on those beaches lived to fight another day. Without them, there would be no defense of Britain, no campaigns in North Africa, no return to Europe. Dunkirk preserved the human foundation upon which all future resistance would rest. Those soldiers carried Dunkirk with them long after they left the beaches behind. The experience shaped how they trained, how they fought, and how they viewed the war. They had learned painful lessons about air superiority, coordination, logistics, and command. These lessons would influence British and Allied strategy in the years to come. When the Allies eventually returned to France in 1944, they did so with an understanding forged in retreat as much as in victory. Internationally, Dunkirk sent a signal that Britain was not finished. To enemies, it showed that total collapse had been narrowly avoided, but also that Britain was capable of rapid adaptation. To potential allies, especially the United States, it demonstrated resilience rather than resignation. Britain's refusal to surrender after such a setback helped shape diplomatic perceptions and laid the groundwork for future cooperation. Dunkirk did not win allies overnight, but it helped convince the world that Britain was worth supporting. Over time, the phrase Dunkirk spirit entered the national vocabulary. It came to represent unity in adversity, calm under pressure, and the willingness of individuals to act for the collective good. Like all symbols, it risked becoming simplified or romanticized. The reality of Dunkirk was brutal, frightening, and costly. Thousands died. An entire campaign was lost. But acknowledging that reality only strengthens the lesson. The spirit that emerged was not born of comfort or confidence, it was born of necessity, fear, and resolve. Dunkirk also stands as a lesson in momentum. The operation succeeded not because conditions were favorable, but because action was taken before paralysis set in. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes imperfectly, but with urgency. Improvised solutions, such as the use of the mole for embarkation or the mobilization of civilian vessels, proved decisive. Every choice, every adaptation, every small boat that braved enemy fire mattered. Together, these actions altered what seemed like an inevitable outcome. Most of all, Dunkirk proved an immutable truth about history and human conflict. Even in the darkest hour, the future is not fixed. Bold action can disrupt expectations. Collective effort can offset material disadvantage. Courage under fire can preserve possibilities that seem already lost. Dunkirk did not end the war, and it did not guarantee victory. But it changed the course of events by keeping hope alive when hope was nearly extinguished. The legacy of Dunkirk endures, because it speaks to more than a single moment in time. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by triumphs, but by how societies respond to failure. Dunkirk was a retreat, but it was also a beginning. From its beaches emerged a determination that would carry Britain through its darkest hours and, eventually, back across the Channel. In saving an army, Dunkirk preserved the chance to change the world that war would leave behind.